In 1814, a Scottish theologian opened his Bible to Genesis chapter 1, fixed his eyes on the space between verse 1 and verse 2, and noticed a crack no one had seen before. He did not speak right away. He let the question sit in silence for a long time, because he knew that once spoken aloud, the entire Christian theological world could never ignore it again. Welcome to the Ancient Mysteries series. In this episode, we explore the hidden prehistoric fracture in Genesis chapter 1 through Hebrew linguistic analysis and cross-textual comparison. We will see that the very first page of the Bible may have sealed away an erased chapter of cosmic history in most people's understanding. The opening of Genesis is straightforward. God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But the gap theorists say, you missed the single most important word. Between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and verse 2, there is a Hebrew conjunction, pronounce va. This word is not a connection, it is a contrast. It means but. God first created a perfect world, but then the earth became formless and void. That invisible gap between two verses is what gap theorists consider the greatest hidden archive in all of Scripture. A sealed cosmic history, a war that happened before Adam, and a world that no longer exists. The gap theory, also known as the restitution theory, was first proposed by Scottish theologian Thomas Chalmers in 1814. He was the first moderator of the Free Church of Scotland, and one of the most influential theologians of the 19th century. The problem Chalmers faced was this. The geology of his day had already uncovered vast fossil layers, estimating Earth's history, at least in the millions of years. Yet the creation narrative in Scripture, on the surface, allowed only 6 days. How could both be true at the same time? Chalmers' answer was, they are both true. They simply happened in different time periods. He believed Genesis verse 1 describes God's distant original creation, while the 6-day creation beginning in verse 2 was a reconstruction after a catastrophe. That catastrophe, that blank space, could have spanned millions of years. Another supporter, geologist and clergyman William Buckland, championed this idea as well, arguing that the fossils preserved in geological strata were the remains of that vanished prehistoric world. Yet the true pillars of the gap theory are not historical debates. They are 3 words buried in the Hebrew original. The first is the verb Hayah, appearing in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. Its core meaning is to be or to exist, but some scholars argue that in this context it should be translated as became, meaning the earth was not created formless and void. The earth became formless and void. The perfect world, at some point in time, went through a violent transformation, and only then became that desolate expanse covered in darkness and water. The second word is Tohu. In the original Hebrew, it means disorder, chaos, emptiness. Imagine this. If you saw it with your own eyes, a perfectly built house suddenly reduced to rubble, swallowed by would you call that the process of construction or the aftermath of destruction? The gap theorists say Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 is describing the scene left behind after something was devastated. The third key lies in the darkness itself. Genesis verse 2 describes the world as being shrouded in darkness. Yet throughout all of Scripture, darkness is almost never a neutral word. It is consistently tied to evil, to judgment. Consider Jude chapter 13 and John chapter 3 verse 19. And yet it is worth noting, God declared the light good in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3. Yet he never said the same about the darkness. If God's original creation was perfect, where did this darkness come from? Job chapter 38 verses 6 and 7 paint a breathtaking picture. Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? Who set its cornerstone in place? When the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Picture that scene. As God was arranging this corner of the cosmos, the stars and angels were not silent observers. They were singing, they were shouting, they were overwhelmed by the sheer act of creation. This image stands in the starkest possible contrast to a world that is formless, void, and covered in darkness. A perfect creation that made angels shout for joy in a scene of dead silence and desolate darkness. How could these two pictures possibly describe the same moment? Isaiah chapter 45 verse 18 points in another direction. The text says that when God created the world, He did not make it a wasteland. He formed it to be inhabited. Gap theorists point out, if God never intended the world to be a wasteland, then the void described in Genesis verse 2 must have been caused by something that happened afterward, and not the original condition of creation. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 13 through 15, is considered by gap theorists to be the most important piece of the puzzle. This passage describes a being who, before his fall, Onse dwelt in Eden, the garden of God. At that time there was no evil. He was an anointed guardian cherub, blameless in his ways, dwelling on the holy mountain of God. Until violence filled his heart, his sin was exposed, and he was cast out. Gap theorists argue that this passage is not describing the historical king of Tyre, but rather Satan's original state before his fall, and that the perfect world that was destroyed is the very Eden described in Ezekiel. The fifth piece of the puzzle comes from a fiercely debated word in Genesis chapter 1 verse 20. In the King James Bible, God tells Adam to fill the earth, yet what He tells Noah is to replenish it. This leads some gap theorists to argue God's use of replenish with Noah implies the earth had already been filled with life once before the flood, and that first filling belonged to another world that had since been destroyed. Critics point out, however, that the Hebrew original in Genesis chapter 1 verses 22 and 28 uses the same word male, simply meaning to fill, with no sense of doing it again. And the word replenish in the King James Version is simply 17th century. English usage at the time, it just meant to fill. Only later did the word shift in, meaning to suggest refilling or restoring. In other words, this entire debate may be nothing more than a translation misunderstanding. The conjunction vav is directly challenged by critics as well. They argued that in the Hebrew, the most natural reading of this conjunction in the context of Genesis verse 2 is and the earth was formless and void. Not but the earth became formless and void. This grammatical link actually emphasizes the continuity of Genesis. Verse 2 is describing the original condition when the creation act of verse 1 was completed, not the aftermath of some catastrophe. Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 states, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. The Hebrew verb used here is asa, meaning to do or to make. Gap theorists argue that asa does not mean creation from nothing, but rather reorganization or reconstruction, meaning the 6 days of creation described not the original act of creation, but a rebuilding of something that had been left in ruins. Critics counter, however, that Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 6 also uses asa to describe God creating the heavens and everything in them, and in that context, it clearly points to creation from nothing, not reorganization. Therefore, asa alone cannot be used to prove the gap theory's position. The gap theory is a framework that only formally emerged in 1814, barely 200 years ago. Before the 19th century, Western biblical commentators had virtually no awareness of any time gap between Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 and 2. Not a single early church father, medieval theologian, or Reformation-era scholar ever proposed the concept of a restitution theory or a pre-Adamic world. The theory arose within a very specific historical context. In the early 19th century, the geological community began widely embracing uniformitarianism. The idea that geological change occurs slowly, continuously, and uniformly, and that Earth's history could stretch into the millions of years or beyond. This finding created enormous tension with the traditional understanding of creation. It was under this pressure that many theologians began reinterpreting Genesis. The gap theory, age theory, progressive creationism, and theistic evolution were proposed one after another, all sharing the same goal: to find enough room within the biblical creation narrative to accommodate the geological evidence. Yet the gap theory never gained broad acceptance in academic circles. The most fundamental objection critics raise is this: if this prehistoric history truly existed, why did God not write it clearly into Scripture? He could have stated it plainly, yet nowhere in the Genesis creation account is there any explicit indication that such a gap exists. That silence within Scripture is itself a problem that cannot simply be sidestepped. Every interpretation of this fracture in Genesis represents humanity's attempt to reach through the limitations of language toward an ancient event that lies far beyond our comprehension. whatever its controversies. The gap theory reveals one thing clearly. Every single word on the first page of the Bible deserves to be taken seriously, because the meaning sealed within those words may run far deeper than we have ever imagined. When we stand between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and verse 2, we are standing at the very edge of what human language can reach. And on the other side of that boundary is the action of God, a moment before time itself began. Whether or not the gap theory ultimately holds, the question it touches is real. Why would a perfect God bring forth a world in chaos? Or was that chaos never something he made at all, but rather the consequence of rebellion, a destruction whose aftermath we are still living inside? Scripture does not write out every answer, but it writes one thing with unmistakable clarity. Over that darkness and chaos, the Spirit of God was still moving, not watching from a distance, not walking away, but preparing to begin again. That may be the single most important detail in the entire gap theory debate, the one most worth pausing over. As Scripture says, a little leaven works through the whole batch of dough. If you find yourself drawn to searching for small truths in the long river of history, subscribe and join us for the next episode.